Her sister's laugh was sharp enough to cut through her skin, the kind that lingered long after the sound faded. Too broke for college, she had mocked, her words dripping with cruel amusement. In that moment, humiliation burned, but outwardly. She gave nothing away, no protest, no defense, just silence and unshakable, deliberate silence. Inside, however, a vow took root, quiet but absolute. One day, she would make her sister choke on that laughter, not with raised voices or petty words, but with a life so far beyond reach that the insult would become her sister's undoing. From that day forward, she wore calmness like a mask. Her sister, drunk on arrogance, paraded her supposed superiority, as though it were permanent, unbreakable. To everyone else, she seemed indifferent, a shadow walking quietly beside the flame of her sister's pride. But behind those still eyes was a storm, brewing with patience, precision, and a hunger sharpened by betrayal. The fury never showed, not once. Her silence disarmed suspicion, leaving her sister blind to the reckoning that was quietly gathering. Humiliation became fuel. Those words, meant to crush, instead lit a spark that burned steady in her chest. Every late night studying, every small job she took on, every ounce of effort that others dismissed was sharpened by memory of that laughter. She did not wish merely to succeed. She would rise so high that her sister's insult would echo back. As a prophecy shattered, ambition grew sharper than pain, turning her into someone who no longer measured her worth against her sister, but against the future she intended to claim. She started small. A scholarship application no one believed she'd win. Long hours at the library while her sister mocked her absence at family dinners. A part-time job where she worked in silence, learning the art of discipline while others wasted time. Every step was deliberate, every move precise. She did not need recognition yet. All she needed was momentum, and she built it carefully, brick by brick, beneath the shadow her sister never imagined she'd escape. Slowly, the world began to tilt. A scholarship accepted, a professor's recommendation, an internship offer that opened doors her sister never knew existed. While her sister bathed in shallow comforts and hollow pride, she climbed in silence, steady as the tide. Opportunities gathered at her feet like whispers, and she seized each one with the quiet confidence of someone who no longer had to prove her worth, only wait for her moment. Her sister laughed less loudly now, though arrogance still wrapped her like armor. Remaining invisible was her greatest weapon. She built networks discreetly, forged alliances without drawing attention, and grew wealth quietly in corners her sister never thought to look. To the world, she was ordinary, unthreatening, an afterthought. But beneath that mask, she constructed an empire in silence. Every contact, every skill, every decision was another step toward the trap that would one day spring shut. Her sister never saw the cracks forming in her own throne. Pride made her careless. Entitlement made her weak. She spent recklessly, burned bridges thoughtlessly, and dismissed those who could have been allies. Her arrogance blinded her to how fragile her position truly was. And all the while, her younger sister was watching. Always watching, every selfish act, every betrayal, every whispered rumor. She collected them all. Evidence piled up quietly, a hidden ledger of flaws and failures. With each new piece, the puzzle of her sister's eventual downfall became clearer. She needed only patience, letting her sister dig her own grave with each careless step. The fatal overstep came sooner than expected. Blinded by pride, her sister signed contracts she didn't understand, took risks she couldn't afford, and dismissed warnings that should have made her cautious. In her arrogance, she walked straight into the snare that had been waiting all along. This was the moment the trap she had set long ago finally closed. Quiet but inescapable, the shift was almost imperceptible at first. A deal collapsed, an investor withdrew, and whispers began to circulate. Suddenly, the power her sister once wielded slipped through her fingers like sand. And standing opposite her, calm and composed, was the sister she had once mocked as too broke. Silence broke now, not in anger, but in the steady revelation of who truly held control. Every lie, every deception was stripped away. The Fod, her sister, clung to crumbled under the harshest light, and there was no dignity left to salvage. Her arrogance had been her shield, but now it was her cage. One by one, the truths came out, leaving her exposed for what she had always been: fragile, careless, and unworthy of the power she once claimed. The fall was swift and merciless. Everything she had built on arrogance collapsed, and the sister who once stood powerless now held the strings. Justice was not delivered with rage or vengeance shouted into the night. It was served with calm authority, in silence, in inevitability. She had not needed to destroy her sister had destroyed herself, and all she had done was hold up the mirror. When the dust settled, she stood in quiet triumph. No gloating, no cruel laughter to mirror the one that had once cut her to the core, just silence, the silence of victory, of a vow fulfilled. Her sister's downfall was complete, and she had risen not through cruelty, but through unshakable control and patience. From the ashes of betrayal, she built her new life, not defined by revenge, but strengthened by it. Success stretched out before her, brighter than anything she had once imagined in those shadowed years. She was no longer too broke, no longer underestimated. She had become untouchable. Her silence transformed into the very power her sister had once mocked, and in the end, there were no words left to speak. The story closed as it began, with silence. But this silence was not born of humiliation. It was the silence of strength, of victory, of a promise fulfilled. The final word was never spoken because it didn't need to be. Her silence said everything. On graduation night, the air was thick with laughter, music, and the scent of triumph. Families cheered for their children. Friends embraced with promises of futures yet to be written. For her, it should have been a night of hope, a closing chapter before new beginnings. Instead, it became a night carved into memory by cruelty. Her sister's laughter, sharp, merciless, and echoing louder than any applause, cut through the celebration. With a smirk and voice raised so the crowd would hear, she mocked her as too broke for college, reducing years of quiet effort into a spectacle of humiliation. Gasps and chuckles rippled through the crowd, leaving her standing frozen, her diploma clutched in trembling hands. But beneath the sting of shame, something stirred, something far colder than despair. She met her sister's eyes, not with rage, but with silence. A vow was born in that silence, a vow that one day, her sister's laughter would be the sound of her undoing. The days that followed painted her as the weaker one. Friends whispered their pity, neighbors repeated her sister's words, and even family echoed the joke. Too broke, they said, as though those words defined her future. Yet, she never protested. Her mask was flawless calm, composed, unreadable. Behind it, however, wounds deepened, and with them, a hunger grew. Every cruel whisper pressed her resolve sharper. To the world, she appeared defeated, a girl resigned to her fate. But in truth, she was planning. She swallowed every insult not as poison, but as fuel. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was the storm before the strike. Her sister basked in her own arrogance, wearing wealth like a crown and entitlement like armor. She flaunted privilege at every turn, her voice loud in clubs, her name printed in charity programs she barely cared about. To everyone else, she was untouchable, the golden child destined to rule over a life of ease. Yet wealth often masks weakness, and pride blinds sharper than any blade. The cracks were their careless spending, shallow friendships, debts whispered behind closed doors. But arrogance makes the blind deaf as well. She never noticed her own decline beginning, never realized her stage was built on fragile foundations. And all the while, her sister, the one she mocked, was watching. Always watching, she learned the value of patience. While her sister drowned in indulgence, she studied late into the night, worked jobs others scorned, and built foundations invisible to the world. Every coin saved, every skill earned, every connection built was another stone in the fortress she was quietly constructing. She said nothing, never flaunted, never revealed the life she was shaping. Each insult stored away, each dismissal remembered, until her silence became a blade sharper than words. Patience was no longer passive, it was her deadliest weapon. Inevitably, pride led her sister into ruin. Believing herself invincible, she signed reckless contracts, borrowed more than she could repay, and surrounded herself with people who applauded her arrogance but abandoned her in private. She underestimated everyone, especially the quiet sister she had once humiliated. To her, that sibling was still powerless, still too broke to matter. And that miscalculation was the fatal mistake. Pride without caution is nothing but a fall, waiting to happen. The shift came slowly at first, then all at once. Whispers of success began to follow the one she once mocked. Her investments flourished, her discipline bore fruit, and her name started appearing in places her sister never expected. Business circles began to speak of her in admiration, while whispers of her sister's failures grew louder. The underdog was rising, and with every step, the storm her sister ignored drew closer. What had begun as silence was now a gathering roar. The revenge was not shouted, nor displayed in rage. It unfolded in calculated movements, precise as a blade. By the time her sister realized the trap, it was too late. Contracts crumbled, investors withdrew, and doors that once opened for her closed one after another. Standing at the center of it all was the sister she had laughed at, the sibling she had dismissed as irrelevant. The world she thought she controlled now bent toward the one she had scorned. The trap had sprung, not with violence but with elegance. She fell into a reality she could no longer escape, one carefully woven from every insult, every dismissal, every moment of arrogance. In the aftermath, there were no triumphant speeches, no cruel laughter thrown back in her face. The victor stood in silence, her strength proven by action, not words. Success was the sharpest blade, and it had cut deeper than any insult ever could. She had risen beyond poverty, beyond humiliation, beyond comparison. Her sister's ruin was complete, and yet she took no pleasure in the wreckage. Her revenge was not in gloating, it was in becoming untouchable, and so silence closed the story just as it had opened it. But this time, it was not the silence of shame. It was the silence of victory, of power reclaimed, of a vow fulfilled. The laughter that once haunted her was gone, replaced by the unshakable truth that patience and strength had been her greatest weapons all along. Her sister's downfall was not her ultimate prize, her own triumph was. The humiliation could have broken her, but instead it lit a fire that refused to die. Nights once meant for rest became nights of numbers, endless pages of finance books, and the steady hum of calculations scribbled across notebooks. What her sister declared as her weakness became her chosen battlefield. She studied balance sheets until dawn, dissected investments with surgical precision, and turned her silence into strategy. Each late hour at the desk was a quiet rebellion, each equation solved, a weapon sharpened. Humiliation had been the spark, but resolve became the fuel. She would not scream or beg, she would build. Still, the past lingered like a shadow. In quiet moments, memories of her sister's cruel words replayed, sharper than any insult could be if spoken once. The laughter in front of their classmates, the smirk when she was branded too broke, the way the crowd had joined in it, all returned unbidden. Yet each flashback was not weakness but a reminder, a blade pressed against her heart to keep it beating harder. Instead of breaking her, those echoes carved her hunger for retribution into something clean, cold, and unshakable. Her silence was not surrender. It was patience biding its time. Time worked in her favor. Step by step, she rose through the ranks of companies that dismissed her as ordinary. She began as an employee, unremarkable, steady, invisible to those who mocked ambition without money. Soon, she learned the hidden rules, absorbed knowledge from mentors, and turned every lesson into leverage. Promotions followed: manager, advisor, then investor. Her sister never noticed. To her, the sibling she once mocked remained irrelevant, a ghost drifting in the background. But behind that invisibility was a climb, steady and certain, a ladder scaled without ever announcing a single step. What she built was not loud or flashy. There were no headlines bearing her name, no speeches about her success. Instead, she crafted an empire hidden in plain sight. Shares bought under different names, partnerships secured through silence, influence that rippled through markets without anyone tracing it back to her. She preferred it that way, unseen, unknown, untouchable. While her sister glittered at galas and flashed borrowed wealth, she tightened her quiet hold over industries that mattered. It was not recognition she sought, it was control. And control, once in her grasp, would never be lost. Meanwhile, the cracks began to form in her sister's crown. At first, small, a loan taken carelessly, a business partner whispering doubts, the kind of debts that privilege seemed to smooth over. But arrogance makes even subtle dangers invisible. Overspending became routine, bad investments piled up, and the confidence that once commanded admiration began to waver behind closed doors. To the public, she was still radiant, but behind the curtain, the foundation of her throne was beginning to rot. Warnings came, as they always do. Advisors urged caution, friends muttered concern, even newspapers hinted at missteps. But pride has no patience for correction. Every word of caution was dismissed, every voice silenced with a laugh. "Do you know who I am?" she would ask, as though her name alone could rewrite numbers on a ledger. In her arrogance, she believed herself untouchable, the very same way she once believed her sister incapable of rising. Pride had blinded her then, and now it was blinding her still. All the while, the trap was being set. The quiet sister who once stood humiliated beneath cruel laughter now held silent strings tied to something far greater, a bank. She had become its unseen architect, pulling levers from behind the curtain. Accounts shifted, investments flowed through its halls, and loans were given with signatures unaware of whose hand truly held the power. It was a fortress disguised as an institution, and soon it would become the stage where her sister's downfall would play out. And then came the foreshadow, subtle yet inevitable. Reckless deals led her sister down paths that seemed gilded, yet all roads turned toward the same destination. Glass doors gleamed at the entrance of the very bank her sibling controlled, waiting with silent inevitability. Her sister, still oblivious, walked closer each day, securing loans she could not repay, signing contracts she barely read, smiling at men who already knew she was walking into a cage. The trap did not need to be forced. Her arrogance carried her straight into it, and waiting within, unseen and silent, was the one she had mocked, ready to watch the glass doors close behind her, the silk of her gowns, the glitter of her jewels, and the flash of her luxury cars could no longer mask the cracks spreading through her empire. Creditors began sending letters dressed in polite language but edged with threat. Investments that once promised golden returns collapsed into ash. Her lavish lifestyle, once envied by all, had become a burden too heavy to bear. Yet she refused to see it as failure, only as a temporary inconvenience. She spent more, flaunted louder, as though appearances could drown out the truth that the crown she wore was beginning to slip. But appearances are fragile, and whispers travel faster than wealth. Friends who once orbited her grandeur began to drift away, their laughter quieter, their loyalty thinner. At galas, her name carried a different tone, spoken not with admiration but with curiosity laced with pity. Behind her back, creditors pressed harder, their patience running thin. Men in suits stood at her gates with contracts in hand, reminding her that charm could not balance ledgers forever. The circle was closing, and though she still walked tall, her steps echoed against walls that were tightening around her. Cornered, she turned to what she believed was her masterstroke, a loan massive enough to cover debts, reckless enough to gamble her future. She had done it before, secured her way out of ruin with the confidence of someone convinced she could never fall. One more, she told herself, and I'll rise again. Her arrogance did not falter. She still believed her name carried the weight of rescue, that no bank would dare refuse her. In her mind, The loan was not a risk but a guarantee, and so she walked straight into the snare her own pride had led her to. The bank's glass doors reflected her image back at her, regal and assured, blind to the truth that each step brought her closer to the sibling she had mocked into silence years before. She didn't see the strings woven around her path, strings pulled tight by unseen hands, directing her every move toward an inevitable collapse. The irony was exquisite. She thought she was saving her throne, but she was walking into the very trap that would dismantle it. Inside, she was greeted with practiced smiles and courteous nods, but something felt off. Where she expected reverence, she found distance. Where she demanded urgency, she received delay. Every form was double-checked, every process prolonged, and yet no one dared to outright refuse her. She mistook it for bureaucracy, never suspecting it was design. Each day that passed tightened the net, and still she believed herself in control. What she could not see, what she would never have imagined, was who held the true power in those polished halls. Behind the glass walls of an upper office, her sibling watched, calm and patient, reviewing every detail of her application. The woman she had once dismissed as powerless was now the silent owner, the decision-maker whose word determined her future, and she gave no sign, no warning, only the cold, steady silence of control. When the final papers were placed before her, she signed without hesitation, her flourish bold and careless. That signature was her undoing. It bound her to terms she could never meet, locked her into repayments designed to suffocate rather than save. In her arrogance, she had sealed her own fate, convinced that her name alone could bend rules. But ink does not forgive, and contracts do not care for pride. The boardroom was prepared for the reveal, though she still believed herself the queen walking into an audience of servants. She entered with her usual poise, expecting deference. But when the door opened and her sibling stepped forward, calm and composed, the truth finally struck. The power she had wielded so carelessly was gone, and the throne she had fought to protect crumbled beneath her. The trap had closed, and the sister she had ridiculed now stood above her, not with laughter or cruelty, but with the quiet weight of justice. She entered the boardroom certain the meeting was a formality. The loan was hers already in her mind, sealed by the weight of her name, but her steps faltered when her eyes landed on the head of the table. There, seated in quiet command, was the sibling she had once humiliated, no longer silent in the shadows but enthroned in authority. For the first time in years, her voice caught in her throat. Power had shifted in a single instant, and she felt it. The silence that followed was unbearable. The room, filled with polished suits and watchful eyes, waited. She forced a smile, brittle and hollow, but the mask cracked around the edges. Confidence that had carried her through every negotiation now wavered beneath the weight of recognition. The ground she stood on, once so certain, trembled with the realization that this was no coincidence. The sibling she dismissed had not only returned, but returned with power greater than her own. When she finally spoke, her words rushed out arguments, defenses, hollow claims of stability. You know I can handle this loan. My ventures are temporary setbacks. I always rise again. Each sentence was a plea dressed as pride, but her sibling did not flinch. Calm, steady, and unreadable, the one she had scorned years ago allowed her desperation to unravel without interruption. Every word she uttered only revealed how little control she had left, and then came the mirror, held up not with cruelty but precision. The same insults she had once spat in arrogance now returned as reasoned judgment. Reckless, unworthy, undeserving. The words struck harder because they were hers, reborn in the calm logic of the sibling she had ridiculed. A name cannot replace responsibility. Wealth without discipline is ruin. You are not fit for trust. Each phrase stripped another layer from her faud until nothing remained but the truth she had spent her life denying. The verdict fell with cold clarity. The loan was denied not with raised voices or anger, but with the finality of undeniable reasoning. No argument could stand against the evidence, No charm could bend the decision. The doors she assumed would open had closed forever, and this time there was no alternate path waiting to save her. She had been refused, not just by a bank, but by the very sibling she had once scorned as powerless. Around her, witnesses sat in silence. The staff, the board, the faceless observers she had always treated as background, now became her audience. Their eyes followed her unraveling, watching the proud woman reduced to pleading. Each breath she took seemed heavier under their gaze. For years she had basked in their admiration. Now they witnessed her humiliation, and no amount of charm could erase what they had seen. At last, the final crack appeared. Pride gave way to desperation, and she found herself begging at the feet of the one she had once mocked. Please, just this once. You can't let me fall like this. Her voice, once commanding, broke into fragments. She saw too late that the destruction was not only financial. The balance of power had turned so completely that her downfall became personal, intimate, undeniable. The throne she fought to keep had been taken by the sibling she had scorned into silence, and then nothing. No triumphant speech, no gloating, no cruel laughter, only silence. That silence cut deeper than any words could. It echoed with every insult she had ever hurled, every moment of mockery, every arrogance that had led her here. Her sibling's restraint was not weakness but strength, a judgment more crushing than anger could ever be. The silence closed the conversation, the deal, and her reign all at once, leaving her to drown in the hollow echo of her own downfall. Her empire collapsed faster than she ever believed possible. The debts she had hidden under layers of bravado were dragged into the open, the rejected loan the final stone that cracked the dam. Creditors circled, investors withdrew, and the same world that once celebrated her as untouchable now watched with sharpened curiosity as everything unraveled. Lavish estates slipped through her fingers, cars were repossessed, and the name that had once commanded awe became synonymous with ruin. The silence of the boardroom had been the beginning. The roar of her downfall was the inevitable echo. One by one, those who had fed on her excess vanished. Friends who toasted her wealth melted into shadows, unwilling to be seen near failure. Business partners who once pledged loyalty cut ties with a speed that stunned her. The woman who believed herself eternal now stood surrounded by ashes of her own making, her golden reputation blackened beyond repair. What she once thought was a throne was revealed to be sand, and arrogance had been the tide that swept it away. While she floundered, the sibling she had mocked remained unshaken. No speeches, no public boasts, only steady expansion, quiet authority, and a presence that needed no defense. The bank grew stronger under calm leadership, its influence reaching further than she had ever imagined. There was no need to gloat. Success itself became the sharpest blade, cutting deeper than any insult could. Where she burned out in a flash of excess, her sibling's triumph glowed with the steady light of permanence. The woman who once strutted at the center of every room was left to wander in obscurity. Her arrogance had built her cage, and now she lived within it, remembered only as a warning. She carried the weight of her own downfall, every glance from strangers a reminder of what she had lost. Once she had called her sibling too broke to matter. Now she lived in the long shadow cast by the one she dismissed, and in the end, the debt was collected in full. Not through shouting, not through vengeance soaked in rage, but through the quiet, immovable dominance of success. What began with mockery ended with silence, a silence more crushing than any words could deliver. The balance had shifted forever, and there would be no return to what she once was. Success was the only revenge I needed. Denying her was just interest on the debt she wrote the day she called me to broke.